He had been silent for 5 long years, but the world was about to discover that sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest miracle. For exactly 5 years, Ethan Romano had remained motionless inside the most secure private hospital in New York, his heartbeat steady, his breathing supported only by careful medical attention, while every specialist money could buy quietly admitted they had run out of answers. Newspapers had once called him the untouchable mafia boss who controlled an empire stretching from Manhattan to the Jersey waterfront. Yet none of that power could convince him to open his eyes again. Outside his hospital suite, executives arrived in expensive suits, attorneys whispered about contracts, and distant relatives discussed inheritance as though the man inside the room had already become part of history. Doctors came and went with polite optimism that slowly faded into routine, until his room became less a place of healing and more a monument to waiting. Every evening, after visitors disappeared and polished hallways felt almost silent, one person still entered without expecting recognition. Grace Miller was only a hospital cleaner, a 31-year-old woman who worked exhausting shifts to help pay for her aging father's medical bills. Most people barely noticed her as she pushed her supply cart through endless corridors, quietly wiping windows, emptying trash bins, and making every room feel a little more human before sunrise returned. She had never spoken to Ethan, never imagined meeting someone whose name filled newspaper headlines, and certainly never expected anything extraordinary to happen inside room 512. Yet before leaving each night, she paused beside his bed for one simple reason. No patient, she believed, deserved complete silence. Her mother had sung the same gentle lullaby every evening throughout her childhood, insisting that even those who could not answer still deserved kindness. Grace carried that memory into every difficult day of her life, and without asking permission from anyone, she softly sang those familiar words while adjusting the curtains and straightening the blankets around the man who could not respond. Nurses occasionally smiled with quiet sympathy, while others assumed it was simply an innocent habit born from compassion. No machine changed. No doctor celebrated. Nothing seemed different at all. Until one snowy evening, as the final note drifted through the softly lit room, a monitor resting beside Ethan's bed suddenly displayed an unexpected change. A nurse looked up. Another stepped closer. The steady rhythm shifted ever so slightly. No alarms sounded, yet every eye in the room froze. For the first time in 5 years, something inside Ethan Romano had answered the sound of a poor cleaner's lullaby. The unexpected movement on the monitor was dismissed as an isolated fluctuation before the night shift ended. But Grace Miller never learned that anything unusual had happened because she had already finished cleaning the last hallway and hurried toward the subway carrying a worn backpack over one shoulder. Her life followed the same demanding schedule every single day. She woke before dawn in a small apartment in Queens, prepared breakfast for her father, made certain he took his medication, then caught 2 different trains across the city before beginning another 12-hour shift at St. Catherine Medical Center. Her paycheck barely covered rent, groceries, and medical expenses, leaving almost nothing for herself. Yet she never complained because she believed that kindness was one of the few things poverty could never take away. Her father often apologized for becoming a burden after years of working construction had damaged his health, but Grace always smiled, squeezed his hand, and reminded him that he had spent his entire life protecting her. Now it was simply her turn to protect him. Every evening before leaving for work, he would quietly ask whether she had remembered to sing, and she always answered yes. It had become their little tradition, one that began years earlier when Grace's mother filled their tiny apartment with the same gentle lullaby during difficult nights when there was barely enough money to keep the lights on. Her mother believed music could calm frightened hearts even when it could not solve impossible problems, and after she passed away, Grace refused to let that memory disappear. She carried the melody with her wherever life became heavy, humming it while cleaning empty hallways, organizing patient rooms, or comforting nervous children waiting for surgery. Most people never noticed. Those who did simply smiled before continuing with their busy routines. Inside the hospital, Grace remained almost invisible to doctors, executives, and wealthy visitors who rarely looked beyond the polished floors she quietly cleaned each night. To them, she was another employee pushing a supply cart through endless corridors. They never asked about the tired eyes hiding sleepless nights or the dreams she quietly postponed so her father could receive proper care. When she entered room 512 again the following evening, she greeted Ethan Romano exactly as she greeted every patient, gently wishing him a peaceful night before straightening the blanket that had slipped slightly from his shoulder. She softly began the familiar lullaby without expecting an audience, unaware that behind the observation window an elderly neurologist had stopped walking after noticing another tiny but unmistakable change in the monitor. This time he did not look at the screen first. He looked directly at Grace, wondering if the quietest person inside the hospital had just become the one nobody could afford to ignore anymore. By the end of the week, the unusual changes could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The elderly neurologist, Dr. Harold Bennett, quietly reviewed every overnight report and discovered a pattern that made little scientific sense. Ethan Romano's brain activity became slightly stronger only during the few minutes when Grace Miller stood beside his bed singing the same gentle lullaby. The moment she left the room, every reading settled back into its familiar stillness. Rather than announcing his observations, Dr. Bennett chose to watch one more evening from behind the observation window. Once again, Grace entered with her cleaning cart, carefully polished the windows, replaced fresh flowers that someone else had forgotten to change, adjusted the blankets, and softly sang with the same humble sincerity she offered every patient. She never looked toward the medical equipment and never noticed the specialists quietly gathering outside the room. When the melody reached its final verse, Ethan's fingers made the faintest movement against the hospital blanket before becoming still again. No one spoke for several long seconds. Meanwhile, life beyond the hospital room moved in a very different direction. Ethan's cousin, Victor Romano, had spent the past 5 years serving as temporary leader of the Romano organization. Publicly, he described every business decision as an effort to honor Ethan's legacy, yet privately he had grown comfortable making permanent plans. Attorneys, financial advisors, and senior executives increasingly sought Victor's approval, believing the sleeping man upstairs would never reclaim his position. Every month that Ethan remained unconscious strengthened Victor's influence, making the possibility of a recovery more inconvenient than hopeful. When Dr. Bennett cautiously mentioned that he wanted additional observation before changing Ethan's medical evaluation, Victor smiled politely, but insisted everyone remain realistic. He reminded the hospital board that false hope could be emotionally damaging for families and financially irresponsible for long-term planning. His words sounded reasonable, and most people accepted them without question. Grace, however, knew nothing about board meetings or inheritance discussions. She continued arriving before sunset, greeting nurses by name, cleaning patient rooms with quiet care, and humming the familiar melody that reminded her of home. She believed she was simply comforting someone who deserved kindness, never imagining powerful people were beginning to notice her presence. Late one evening, after reviewing another series of recordings, Dr. Bennett searched through Ethan's childhood medical records and found an old family interview mentioning that Ethan's late mother had sung the very same traditional lullaby every night until he fell asleep. The discovery left the physician staring silently at the page, realizing that perhaps memory could travel farther into darkness than modern medicine had ever imagined. The following evening, Dr. Harold Bennett quietly arranged for 2 additional specialists to observe from behind the glass without telling Grace they would be there. He wanted to eliminate every possible coincidence before presenting his findings to the hospital board. As the clock reached 8 o'clock, Grace pushed her familiar cleaning cart into room 512, greeted Ethan with the same warm smile she offered every patient, and carefully completed her routine. She opened the curtains just enough to reveal the soft glow of city lights beyond the window, replaced the water in a small vase beside the bed, folded a blanket that had slipped onto the floor, and finally rested one gentle hand on the bed rail before beginning the lullaby she had carried since childhood. Her voice remained soft and untrained, filled not with performance, but with genuine compassion. For a few quiet moments, nothing appeared unusual. Then Ethan's breathing became slightly deeper. The monitor displayed a subtle but unmistakable increase in neurological activity. One physician instinctively stepped closer to the glass while another checked the equipment twice, convinced a sensor had malfunctioned. Dr. Bennett never looked away from Ethan's face. As Grace reached the final lines of the song, a single tear slowly formed at the corner of Ethan's closed eye and rolled across his cheek before disappearing into the pillow. The room beyond the observation window fell completely silent. No machine could explain tears from a man who had remained unresponsive for 5 years. Grace noticed the tear only after finishing the lullaby. Believing it was simply moisture from the artificial humidity inside the room, she gently wiped it away with a clean tissue and wished Ethan a peaceful night before quietly leaving with her cart. She never realized that everyone behind the glass had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their careers. Dr. Bennett immediately ordered additional neurological testing, but before any formal report could be completed, word reached Victor Romano that Ethan's condition might no longer be completely unchanged. Victor arrived at the hospital the following morning wearing a calm smile that concealed growing concern. He politely questioned the doctors, carefully asking whether emotional stories from exhausted staff might be creating unrealistic expectations. During the meeting, he casually suggested that unnecessary visitors should be limited to preserve a controlled medical environment, including non-essential employees entering Ethan's room. The recommendation sounded practical, and several administrators quietly agreed. That afternoon, Grace was informed that her cleaning assignments had been changed to another floor effective immediately. She accepted the decision without complaint, thanked her supervisor, and walked away believing it was nothing more than an ordinary scheduling adjustment. She did not know that as she left the hallway for the first time in years, Ethan's monitors slowly returned to the same unchanging rhythm that had defined the previous 5 years, leaving Dr. Bennett with an unsettling realization that the one person considered least important might have become the most essential part of Ethan Romano's recovery. Grace accepted her new assignment with the same quiet humility she brought to every challenge, never questioning why her schedule had suddenly changed or why room 512 had disappeared from her nightly route. She spent the following evenings cleaning another wing of the hospital, smiling politely at patients and coworkers, while something deep inside her felt strangely unsettled. She could not explain it, but every night as the clock approached 8 o'clock, she found herself thinking about the silent man she had wished peaceful dreams for over so many years. Meanwhile, Dr. Harold Bennett watched the latest neurological reports with growing concern. Since Grace had stopped entering Ethan Romano's room, the small but remarkable improvements had vanished completely. Ethan's breathing returned to its familiar mechanical rhythm. His brain activity settled into the same unchanging pattern, and the mysterious signs of awareness disappeared as though they had never existed. The physician reviewed every chart, every recording, and every medical variable, but only one detail had changed. Grace was no longer there. Convinced that ignoring the evidence would be a greater mistake than following an impossible theory, Dr. Bennett quietly searched for Grace after her shift ended. He found her organizing cleaning supplies in a storage room, carefully folding fresh towels before placing them on a cart. She immediately apologized, believing she had somehow forgotten an assignment. Instead, the doctor gently asked her a question that caught her completely by surprise. Would she be willing to sing outside Ethan's room for just a few minutes after work? Grace looked confused and almost embarrassed. She explained that she was not a professional singer and had only ever sung because her mother taught her that familiar songs could make lonely people feel less alone. Dr. Bennett smiled kindly and replied that sometimes compassion accomplished what expertise could not. That evening, after receiving permission from hospital administration to remain a few extra minutes, Grace quietly stood outside the closed door of room 512 because her reassignment no longer allowed her inside. She closed her eyes and softly sang the same lullaby into the silent hallway, expecting nothing except the comfort of honoring an old habit. Inside the room, 2 nurses exchanged astonished glances as Ethan's heartbeat became slightly stronger and his fingers gently tightened around the edge of the blanket for the first time without anyone touching him. Dr. Bennett watched the monitors in complete silence, his eyes slowly filling with hopeful disbelief. At nearly the same moment, Victor Romano entered the hospital through the main lobby and noticed unusual activity gathering around Ethan's floor. For the first time since taking control of the Romano Empire, he realized that something beyond his influence had quietly begun changing the future he believed already belonged to him. The quiet experiment continued for 3 more evenings, and each night produced the same astonishing result. Grace remained outside room 512 because hospital policy still prevented her from entering. Yet the moment her gentle lullaby echoed through the hallway, Ethan Romano's vital signs responded with unmistakable consistency. His breathing became steadier, subtle neurological activity appeared across the monitoring screens, and small movements returned to fingers that had remained completely still for 5 years. Dr. Harold Bennett documented every change with careful precision, inviting additional specialists to review the recordings so that no one could dismiss the evidence as wishful thinking. Even the most skeptical physicians reluctantly admitted they could not explain why the pattern repeated with such remarkable accuracy. Grace herself remained unaware of the growing excitement. She finished each song with quiet humility, thanked the nurses for allowing her to remain a few extra minutes after work, and returned home believing she was simply offering comfort to someone who might somehow still hear her voice. Meanwhile, Victor Romano became increasingly unsettled as confidential medical updates reached his office. He maintained his calm public image, encouraging patience and professionalism. Yet privately, he questioned every report that suggested Ethan's condition was improving. During another meeting with hospital administrators, Victor politely recommended ending the unusual observation sessions, arguing that unproven emotional routines could distract doctors from established medical treatment. Dr. Bennett respectfully disagreed. He explained that Grace was never presented as a medical cure, only as an important environmental factor that deserved continued observation because the measurable changes could no longer be ignored. The discussion ended without agreement, leaving tension quietly hanging over the hospital. That evening, snow gently covered the streets outside while Grace stood once more beyond the closed door and began singing the familiar melody her mother had once sung to her. Inside the room, every monitor displayed gradual improvement. Then something happened that no chart had ever recorded before. Ethan slowly turned his head a fraction toward the doorway, as though searching for the distant sound. A nurse gasped softly, and another immediately called Dr. Bennett, who entered just in time to witness Ethan's eyelids trembling for several long seconds. The room became completely still. Grace, unaware of what was unfolding inside, reached the final words of the lullaby and quietly whispered, "Good night. I hope tomorrow is a little brighter for you." At that exact moment, Ethan's eyes slowly opened for the first time in 5 years. His vision remained blurred, his breathing unsteady, but he looked toward the doorway with quiet determination before forming the first fragile words anyone had heard since the accident. "Please, do not let her leave." Every doctor, every nurse, and every person standing inside the room fell into absolute silence, realizing they had just witnessed a moment that would change every life connected to Ethan Romano forever. For several long moments, no one inside room 512 moved. The only sound came from the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, now stronger than anyone had heard in years. Dr. Harold Bennett carefully stepped closer to Ethan Romano and gently asked whether he knew where he was. Ethan blinked slowly, struggling to focus as though emerging from an endless dream. His voice remained weak, but his eyes searched beyond every doctor and every nurse standing around his bed. He whispered the same request once more. "Please, bring her back." The staff immediately understood he was not asking for a specialist or a family member. He was searching for the quiet woman whose voice had reached him through the darkness. A nurse hurried into the hallway and found Grace preparing to leave for the evening, completely unaware that the impossible had already happened. She looked confused when asked to return, quietly apologizing because she believed she was no longer permitted near the room. Dr. Bennett met her at the doorway with a reassuring smile and simply said, "Someone would like to thank you." Grace entered slowly, clutching the strap of her worn backpack with both hands. The room felt strangely overwhelming as physicians, administrators, and nurses silently stepped aside. Ethan turned his head toward her with visible effort. His eyes rested on her face for several seconds before filling with quiet emotion. He smiled faintly and whispered that he remembered hearing her voice every night, even when he could not move or speak. He explained that the lullaby had become a light inside endless darkness, guiding him whenever everything else disappeared. Grace stood speechless, tears gathering in her eyes as she gently admitted she had only wanted him to feel less alone. She never imagined he could hear a single word. Dr. Bennett then revealed the remarkable discovery about Ethan's childhood medical records and the lullaby his late mother had once sung to him. Ethan closed his eyes briefly and nodded. He remembered falling asleep to that same melody as a little boy while his mother sat beside his bed during difficult times. Hearing it again had reached a place inside his memory that nothing else could touch. The room became deeply emotional, not because of wealth or influence, but because everyone present witnessed the extraordinary power of simple compassion. News of Ethan's awakening quickly spread throughout the hospital, reaching Victor Romano within minutes. He arrived expecting to control the situation with calm confidence. But when he entered the room, he found Ethan fully awake, quietly holding Grace's hand in gratitude, while every member of the medical staff looked at the humble cleaner with a respect she had never experienced before. In that silent moment, Victor understood that the future he had carefully planned had already begun slipping beyond his reach. Recovery came slowly, but every new day confirmed that Ethan Romano had returned with a clarity that surprised even the physicians guiding his rehabilitation. Although his body still required therapy after 5 years without normal movement, his mind remained remarkably sharp. He asked thoughtful questions about the passing years, thanked every nurse who had cared for him, and insisted on meeting every employee who had quietly helped maintain his room during the long seasons when most people believed he would never awaken. Grace tried to avoid the attention, returning to her regular duties as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She smiled politely whenever someone congratulated her, always answering that she had done nothing special. In her heart, she still believed the doctors deserved the credit and that she had simply shared a song from childhood. Ethan disagreed. One afternoon, after completing another therapy session, he asked Dr. Harold Bennett to invite Grace into the room once more. She entered with the same humble expression, expecting only to wish him well before returning to work. Instead, Ethan thanked her again, this time with greater strength in his voice. He explained that while his body had remained trapped in silence, he had never completely lost awareness. There were moments when distant sounds reached him like faint echoes, and among all those voices, hers had become the one constant reminder that compassion still existed outside the darkness. Grace quietly lowered her eyes, struggling to accept praise for something that had always felt so ordinary. Ethan then made an unexpected offer. He wanted to establish a charitable foundation in honor of his late mother, dedicated to supporting long-term patients and families who could not afford extended medical care, and he asked Grace to help shape its mission because she understood loneliness inside hospitals better than anyone else he had ever met. She hesitated immediately, explaining that she had no business education, no executive experience, and no place leading such an important project. Ethan smiled gently and replied that kindness, honesty, and the ability to see people others overlooked were qualifications that could never be taught in any boardroom. Across the room, Victor Romano listened in complete silence. He realized that Ethan had already begun reviewing years of financial records and organizational decisions with the same careful attention that once made him an exceptional leader. Without anger or public humiliation, Ethan calmly announced that an independent audit would examine every major decision made during his absence so the future of the Romano organization could be built on complete transparency. No accusations filled the room, yet the message was unmistakable. Those who had acted responsibly had nothing to fear, and those who had not would be held accountable through lawful and ethical means. Grace watched quietly from the doorway, still wearing her simple hospital uniform, realizing that true strength did not announce itself with power or wealth. It revealed itself through gratitude, fairness, and the courage to honor the quiet acts of kindness that had changed everything. 1 year later, the quiet hallway outside room 512 looked very different, yet one familiar sound still echoed through St. Catherine Medical Center every evening. Grace Miller continued singing the same gentle lullaby, not because anyone expected another miracle, but because the song had become a symbol of hope for patients and families facing their own uncertain journeys. Nurses often paused for a moment to listen. Children smiled from nearby rooms, and anxious relatives found unexpected comfort in the simple melody that reminded them no one should ever face illness alone. Ethan Romano had fully recovered after months of determined rehabilitation. Although he had returned to leading the Romano organization, those who worked beside him noticed that he had changed in ways no one could have predicted. His first major decision was not a business expansion or a financial investment. Instead, he fulfilled the promise he had made to Grace. Together, they established the Romano Family Foundation, providing financial assistance for long-term patients, offering free counseling for caregivers, and ensuring that families with limited resources would never have to choose between medical treatment and basic necessities. Grace refused every offer of luxury that came her way. She declined an executive office, expensive gifts, and public recognition, asking only to continue serving patients while helping guide the foundation's charitable programs. Ethan respected her wishes completely, often saying that the greatest leaders were not always the ones standing behind microphones, but the ones quietly changing lives without asking for applause. The independent audit of the organization concluded with professionalism and fairness, bringing important reforms that strengthened transparency and restored confidence among employees and partners. Ethan focused on building a future grounded in responsibility rather than fear, believing that trust created stronger foundations than power alone ever could. Dr. Harold Bennett retired several months later after a distinguished career, but before leaving the hospital, he placed a framed copy of the Lullaby's handwritten lyrics inside the rehabilitation wing. Beneath it, a small plaque carried a simple message: kindness reaches places that medicine cannot always see. Visitors often stopped to read those words without knowing the extraordinary story behind them. On a quiet winter evening, Ethan visited the hospital once again, not as a patient, but as a grateful friend. Standing silently outside the children's recovery unit, he listened as Grace softly sang to a frightened little boy preparing for surgery the next morning. The child slowly closed his eyes, comfort replacing fear one gentle note at a time. Ethan smiled, understanding that the greatest miracle in his life had never been waking from a coma. It had been discovering that the voice of an ordinary woman with an extraordinary heart could remind even the most powerful man that compassion is the strongest force any person can ever possess.